At the pulpit stood Pastor Philip Jackson, his rich baritone voice filling the sanctuary with words of hope and redemption. To the congregation, he was the epitome of a man blessed by God, successful, charismatic, and the proud father of 4 beautiful children. Little did they know that beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family lay a truth so devastating it would shatter lives and shock an entire community. As Pastor Philip's gaze swept over his flock, it lingered for a moment on his wife, Ellen, seated in the front row. Her serene smile betrayed nothing of the secrets she harbored, secrets that would soon unravel the very fabric of their lives. This is the story of how a man of God became a monster, how a pillar of the community fell from grace, and how a single revelation led to a horrific act that would forever change the landscape of a tight-knit Atlanta neighborhood. Philip Jackson had always been destined for greatness, or so it seemed. Born into a family of preachers, he had taken to the pulpit like a fish to water. His father, the venerable Reverend Isaiah Jackson, had led a small church in the heart of Atlanta's West End neighborhood back in the 1970s. It was a time of change, of hope, and of growing prosperity for the African American community in the area. From a young age, Philip had shown a natural talent for public speaking and an uncanny ability to connect with people. His warm brown eyes and easy smile put everyone at ease, and his words seemed to touch the very souls of those who listened. It was no surprise when, at the age of 25, he took over as lead pastor of Graceful Redemption upon his father's retirement. Under Philip's leadership, the church flourished. The congregation grew, community outreach programs expanded, and Graceful Redemption became known as a beacon of hope in the neighborhood. But it wasn't just his professional life that seemed blessed. At 28, Philip married Ellen Green, a beautiful and devoted woman who shared his passion for ministry. The Jackson family grew quickly. Within 6 years of their marriage, they were blessed with 4 children, Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth. Each child seemed to be a perfect blend of their parents, Philip's warm eyes and Ellen's gentle smile, his quick wit and her nurturing nature. To the outside world, the Jacksons were the very picture of a blessed family. Their home, a beautiful Victorian-style house just a few blocks from the church, was always open to members of the congregation. Ellen was the perfect pastor's wife, supportive, involved in church activities, and a loving mother to their children. As the years passed, Philip's influence in the community grew. He became known not just as a spiritual leader but as a community advocate. He spoke out against injustice, rallied for better schools in the neighborhood, and worked tirelessly to improve the lives of his congregation and the wider community. By the time Philip turned 40, he was at the height of his career. Graceful Redemption had grown to a congregation of over 3,000 members. The church had expanded its facilities, adding a community center and a school. Philip was invited to speak at conferences across the country, and there were even whispers of him running for political office. On Sundays, the Jackson family was a sight to behold. Philip, resplendent in his tailored suits, would stand at the church doors, greeting parishioners as they arrived. Ellen, always elegantly dressed, would be by his side, their 4 children lined up beside them like stair steps. Joshua, the eldest at 12, was already showing signs of following in his father's footsteps. He had his father's charisma and often led the youth group in prayers. Caleb, 10, was the athlete of the family, excelling in every sport he tried. Esther, 8, was a budding pianist, her small fingers dancing across the keys during Sunday school. And little Ruth, just 6, was the darling of the congregation with her angelic voice in the children's choir. The Jacksons seemed to have it all, a thriving ministry, a beautiful family, and the respect and admiration of their community. They were living proof of God's blessings. Or so everyone thought. But beneath the surface of this perfect facade, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would soon split wide open, revealing a truth so shocking it would shake the foundations of everything Philip Jackson had built. It was a crisp autumn morning when the first tremor hit the Jackson family's perfect world. Ellen had taken Caleb for his annual checkup at Grady Memorial Hospital. At 10 years old, Caleb was in the prime of health, his body lean and strong from hours of baseball practice and pickup basketball games in the church parking lot. Dr. Iva Carter, the family's longtime pediatrician, greeted them with a warm smile. "How's our future MLB star doing today?" she asked, ruffling Caleb's curly hair. Caleb grinned, showing off the gap where his front tooth had recently fallen out. "I hit 3 home runs last week, Dr. Carter." As Dr. Carter began the routine examination, Ellen couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Caleb was growing into such a fine young man, so much like his father in his determination and zest for life. The checkup proceeded normally until Dr. Carter frowned slightly while reviewing Caleb's chart. "Mrs. Jackson," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "I notice here that we don't have a record of Caleb's blood type. It's important information to have on file, especially for an active child like him. Would you mind if we do a quick blood test today?" Ellen nodded, seeing no reason for concern. "Of course, Dr. Carter. Whatever you think is best." A week later, Ellen received a call from Dr. Carter's office asking her and Philip to come in for a consultation. Confused but not overly worried, they scheduled an appointment for the following day. As they sat in Dr. Carter's office, hand in hand, neither Philip nor Ellen could have prepared themselves for what they were about to hear. Dr. Carter entered, her usually cheerful face etched with concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, thank you for coming in. I'm afraid I have some unexpected news regarding Caleb's blood test results." Philip leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Is everything all right with our son?" Dr. Carter took a deep breath. "Physically, Caleb is in perfect health. However, the blood test revealed something unusual. According to our records, you, Mr. Jackson, have type A blood, and you, Mrs. Jackson, have type B. But Caleb's blood type is O negative." Ellen blinked, not understanding the significance. Is that a problem?" Dr. Carter's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Jackson, Mr. Jackson, given your blood types, it's biologically impossible for Caleb to be your biological child." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Philip felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He turned to Ellen, expecting to see shock mirroring his own. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold: guilt. The drive home from the hospital was silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations and fear. As soon as they entered their home, Philip rounded on Ellen. "What's going on, Ellen? How is this possible?" His voice was low, controlled, but trembling with barely suppressed rage. Ellen sank onto the couch, her face in her hands. "Philip, I can explain." But Philip wasn't listening. A terrible suspicion had taken root in his mind. "It's not just Caleb, is it?" he whispered. Ellen's silence was all the confirmation he needed. In that moment, Philip Jackson felt his world crumbling around him. The perfect family he had built, the life he had created, it was all built on a lie. As the reality of the situation sank in, Philip made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. "We need to test all the children," he said, his voice hollow. Ellen looked up, her eyes pleading. "Philip, please, can't we just—" "No." Philip cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "We're going to get to the bottom of this. All of it." Little did either of them know that this was just the beginning. The tremors they felt now were merely a prelude to the earthquake that was about to shake their lives, and the lives of everyone around them, to the very core. In the days following the revelation about Caleb's blood type, Philip Jackson found himself living in a fog of disbelief and barely contained anger. He went through the motions of his daily life, leading prayers, counseling parishioners, playing with his children, but inside, he was a man possessed by a single-minded determination to uncover the truth. Ellen had retreated into herself, avoiding Philip's gaze and speaking only when necessary. She knew the reckoning was coming, but she clung desperately to the hope that somehow, some way, their family could survive this. Philip, however, was leaving nothing to chance. Without telling Ellen, he scheduled DNA tests for all 4 children. On a sunny Wednesday afternoon, under the guise of a special family outing, Philip took Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth to a discreet testing facility on the outskirts of Atlanta. As the technician swabbed each child's cheek, Philip felt a mix of emotions churning in his gut. Part of him prayed for a miracle, that somehow, the blood test had been wrong, that these beautiful children were truly his flesh and blood. But another part, a darker part that was growing stronger by the day, prepared for the worst. A week later, Philip sat alone in his study, staring at the envelope that held the answers to his burning questions. The children were at school, and Ellen was volunteering at the church's food bank. With trembling hands, he tore open the envelope and unfolded the papers inside. As his eyes scanned the results, Philip felt the last remnants of his world collapse around him. The clinical language of the report couldn't soften the brutal truth. None of the children were his. Not Joshua. Not Caleb. Not Esther. Not Ruth. None of them were biologically his. Philip sat in stunned silence, the papers clutched in his shaking hands. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow louder, marking the seconds of his old life slipping away. How many Sunday sermons had he given about honesty and fidelity? How many couples had he counseled, stressing the importance of trust in a marriage? And all the while, he had been living a lie. As the initial shock began to wear off, a new emotion took its place, rage. Pure, unadulterated rage coursed through Philip's veins. He had been betrayed, humiliated, made a fool of in front of his entire congregation. And Ellen. Ellen had lied to him for years. She had watched him love and raise children that weren't his, had accepted his love and devotion while carrying this secret. In that moment, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his study, something fundamental changed in Philip Jackson. The compassionate pastor, the loving father, the devoted husband, all of these personas fell away, revealing a man consumed by betrayal and a thirst for vengeance. When Ellen returned home that evening, she found Philip waiting for her in the living room. The children were staying at a church member's house for a sleepover, an arrangement Philip had made to ensure privacy for what was to come. "Sit down, Ellen," Philip said, his voice eerily calm. "We need to talk." Ellen hesitated in the doorway, sensing the storm about to break. Slowly, she made her way to the armchair across from Philip and perched on the edge, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Philip held up the DNA test results. "I had the children tested," he said, watching Ellen's face crumple in realization. "None of them are mine, Ellen. Not a single one." Ellen's sob broke the tense silence. "Philip, I'm so sorry. I never meant." "Never meant what?" Philip's voice rose, the calm facade cracking. "Never meant to lie to me for 12 years? Never meant to pass off another man's children as mine? Never meant for me to find out?" Tears streamed down Ellen's face as she shook her head helplessly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I love you, Philip. I've always loved you." "Love?" Philip spat the word out like it was poison. "If this is love, Ellen, I'd hate to see what betrayal looks like." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "I want the truth. All of it. Who is the father?" Ellen's silence stretched on, broken only by her quiet sobs. "Who is it?" Philip roared, causing Ellen to flinch. "Jeremiah," Ellen whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's Jeremiah." The name hit Philip like a physical blow. Jeremiah Simons. His mentor. His friend. The senior pastor who had taken Philip under his wing when he first joined the ministry. The man who had officiated their wedding. Philip felt the room spin around him as the full weight of the betrayal crashed down. Not only had his wife been unfaithful, but she had been unfaithful with the one man he had trusted above all others. How long? Philip's voice was drained of all emotion. Ellen's response was barely a whisper. Since before we were married. At that moment, something inside Philip Jackson snapped. The carefully constructed facade of the righteous man of God fell away completely, revealing a creature of pure rage and pain. As he looked at Ellen, the woman he had loved, the mother of the children he had raised as his own, Philip made a decision that would seal both their fates. In his mind, warped by betrayal and humiliation, there was only one way to cleanse this sin, to erase the stain on his life and his ministry. Ellen must have seen something change in Philip's eyes because she stood up suddenly, backing away. "Philip," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you thinking? Please, we can work this out. For the children." "The children?" Philip's laugh was hollow, devoid of any mirth. "They're not my children, Ellen. They never were." As Philip advanced toward Ellen, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, the stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the community to its core and forever change the lives of everyone involved. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the Jackson home, marking the seconds as Philip moved closer. Ellen's eyes, wide with fear, darted around the room, searching for an escape route. "Philip, please," Ellen pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Think about what you're doing. This isn't you." But the man before her wasn't the Philip she had known for the past 12 years. Gone was the compassionate pastor, the loving father. In his place stood a stranger, his eyes dark with a rage she had never seen before. "You're right, Ellen," Philip said, his voice unnaturally calm. "This isn't me. The man you married, the man who raised those children, he doesn't exist. He never did. He was a lie. Just like everything else in this marriage." Ellen's back hit the wall, and she realized with a jolt of terror that she had nowhere left to run. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. We can fix this, Philip. We can get counseling, we can." Her words were cut off as Philip's hands closed around her throat. "Fix this," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "How do you propose we fix 12 years of lies, Ellen? How do we fix the fact that every time I looked at those children, loved those children, I was loving another man's flesh and blood?" Ellen clawed at Philip's hands, her lungs burning as she struggled for air. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision as she searched desperately for any sign of the man she once knew. But that man was gone. With a strength born of desperation, Ellen brought her knee up sharply, connecting with Philip's groin. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She stumbled away, gasping for air, her mind racing. The front door was too far. She'd never make it before Philip recovered. The kitchen. Yes. The kitchen. She could lock herself in. Call for help. Ellen ran, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors. Behind her, she could hear Philip's labored breathing, feel his rage radiating through the air. She burst into the kitchen, slamming the door behind her and fumbling with the lock. Click. The lock engaged just as Philip's body slammed against the other side of the door. "Ellen." His voice was a roar, barely human. "Open this door." Ellen backed away, her eyes darting around the kitchen. Her purse. Where was her purse? Her phone. She needed her phone. The door shuddered as Philip threw his weight against it again. The wood began to splinter. There, her purse, sitting on the counter. Ellen lunged for it, dumping its contents onto the floor. Lipstick. Keys. Wallet. Where was her phone? The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. Philip stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with murderous intent. "No more running, Ellen," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "It's time to face what you've done." Ellen's hand closed around a knife from the cutting block. She held it out in front of her, the blade trembling. "Stay back, Philip. I don't want to hurt you." Philip's laugh was cold. "Hurt me, Ellen? You've already done that. You've hurt me in ways I didn't even know were possible." He lunged forward. The kitchen would bear witness to an unspeakable horror before dawn. At the center of a scene of unimaginable horror stood Pastor Philip Jackson. The pristine white tiles were stained crimson, the air heavy with the metallic scent of blood. Philip looked down at his hands, caked with dried blood, and felt a wave of nausea wash over him. What had he done? How had he, a man of God, a shepherd to his flock, fallen so far? But even as part of him recoiled in horror at his actions, another part, a darker, primal part, felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The betrayal had been answered, the sin had been washed clean in blood. As the reality of what he had done began to sink in, Philip's mind raced. He couldn't be found here, he couldn't let anyone see what had happened. His ministry, his reputation, his freedom, all of it was at stake. With a clarity that surprised him, Philip began to formulate a plan. He would need to clean up, dispose of the evidence, and then disappear, start a new life far away from Atlanta and the shattered remains of his old life. As he set about his grim task, Philip's thoughts turned to the children, Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth. They would wake up soon, expecting to return home to their parents. Instead, they would find themselves at the center of a tragedy that would forever alter the course of their lives. For a moment, Philip felt a pang of regret. Despite everything, he had loved those children, raised them, nurtured them, watched them grow. But they weren't his, they had never been his. They were living, breathing reminders of Ellen's betrayal and Jeremiah's treachery. No, Philip decided, it was better this way, a clean break, a fresh start. As the sun rose over Atlanta, Philip set about rebuilding his life, leaving behind the shattered remains of his old one. Atlanta cast long shadows across the Jackson home. Philip Jackson, once a respected pastor and a pillar of the community, began the process of erasing all traces of the life he had known. The shepherd had become the wolf, and there was no going back. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Deacon Walter Green pulled into the driveway of the Jackson residence. As head of the church's youth ministry, he had agreed to drop off the Jackson children after their sleepover. The house stood silent, its windows dark, giving no hint of the horror that lay within. "All right, kids," Walter said cheerfully, turning to the back seat where Joshua, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth sat, still groggy from sleep. "Looks like your folks might still be asleep. Why don't we surprise them with some breakfast?" The children tumbled out of the car, excited at the prospect of surprising their parents. Walter followed, a grocery bag filled with pancake mix and syrup in hand. As they approached the front door, he noticed something odd, it was slightly ajar. "That's strange," he muttered, a frown creasing his brow. "Kids, wait here a moment." Walter pushed the door open, calling out, "Philip? Ellen? It's Walter, we're back with the kids." The silence that greeted him was oppressive, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. As Walter stepped further into the house, a coppery smell assaulted his nostrils, making his stomach turn. "Philip," he called again, his voice wavering slightly. "Ellen?" He made his way toward the kitchen, his heart pounding in his chest. As he rounded the corner, the grocery bag slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The kitchen, once a warm and inviting space where the Jacksons had hosted countless church gatherings, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood stained the white tiles, splattered across the countertops and cabinets. And there, in the center of it all, lay Ellen Jackson, or what remained of her. Walter staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Not to Philip and Ellen. Not to this family that had been a cornerstone of their community for so long. With trembling hands, Walter pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As he spoke to the dispatcher, his voice shaking, he suddenly remembered the children waiting outside. Oh God, the children. How could he protect them from this? How could he shield them from the knowledge that their world had just been shattered beyond repair? Within minutes, the quiet street in front of the Jackson home was transformed into a chaotic scene of flashing lights and wailing sirens. Police cars and ambulances clogged the driveway and spilled onto the lawn. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered in small groups, whispering and pointing. Detective Aisha Carter ducked under the yellow crime scene tape, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene. At 38, she was one of the youngest detectives in the Atlanta Police Department's homicide unit, known for her sharp intellect and unwavering determination. As she entered the kitchen, Aisha steeled herself. In her 10 years on the force, she had seen her fair share of gruesome crime scenes. But this was something else entirely. What do we know? She asked the uniformed officer who had been first on the scene. The officer, a young man whose face had a greenish tinge, swallowed hard before responding. Victim is Ellen Jackson, 39 years old, wife of Pastor Philip Jackson of Graceful Redemption Baptist Church. 4 children, all of whom were thankfully not home at the time of the incident. Aisha nodded, her eyes scanning the room. And Pastor Jackson? No sign of him, detective. His car is gone from the driveway. A frown creased Aisha's brow. A missing spouse was always suspicious in cases like this. But Philip Jackson was no ordinary spouse, he was a respected community leader, a man of God. The idea of him being involved in something like this seemed almost inconceivable. Almost. I want a bolo out on Pastor Jackson in his vehicle, Aisha instructed. And get me everything you can on the family, phone records, bank statements, the works. Something led to this, and I want to know what it was. As the CSI team began their meticulous work, photographing and cataloging every blood spatter and fingerprint, Aisha stepped outside. The morning air, usually fresh and invigorating, now felt heavy with the weight of tragedy. Her eyes fell on a group of children huddled together near a police car, blankets draped over their shoulders. The Jackson children. Aisha's heart clenched. In all her years on the force, this was the part that never got easier, dealing with the innocent victims left behind in the wake of violence. She approached slowly, crouching down to their level. "Hi there," she said softly. "I'm Detective Carter. Can you tell me your names?" The oldest boy, his eyes red-rimmed from crying, spoke up. "I'm Joshua. These are my siblings, Caleb, Esther, and Ruth." His voice cracked as he asked, "Where's our mom? Where's our dad? No one will tell us what's going on." Aisha took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Joshua, something bad has happened. Your mom, she's been hurt very badly. We're doing everything we can to find out what happened and to find your dad. But we want to see Mom," the younger boy, Caleb, insisted. "Why can't we see her?" Aisha felt her throat tighten. How do you explain to children that their mother has been brutally murdered? That their father is missing and quite possibly responsible? That their entire world has just been torn apart? Been turned upside down in the span of a single night? "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you can't see your mom right now. We're going to take you somewhere safe, okay? Somewhere where people will take care of you while we figure all this out." As a social worker arrived to take custody of the children, Isa watched them go, their small figures dwarfed by the chaos around them. She felt a familiar anger building inside her, anger at the senseless violence, at the lives shattered, at the innocence lost. With renewed determination, she turned back to the crime scene. Somewhere in that house, in the blood-soaked kitchen or the deceptively normal living room, were the answers she needed. And she would find them, no matter what it took. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh light on the scene of tragedy, the news began to spread through Atlanta like wildfire. The beloved Pastor Philip Jackson was missing. His wife, Ellen, was dead. And nothing in their community would ever be the same again. News of the tragedy at the Jackson home spread through Atlanta's West End neighborhood with shocking speed. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside Graceful Redemption Baptist Church, their faces a mix of shock, grief, and disbelief. Among them was Deacon James Watkins, Philip's right-hand man in the church leadership, stared at the growing crowd, his mind reeling, unable to reconcile the horrific news with the Philip and Ellen he thought he knew. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, running a hand over his face. "It just can't be." But it was happening. As the de facto leader of the church in Philip's absence, James knew he had to do something. With a heavy heart, he climbed the steps to the church entrance and turned to face the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "I know you've all heard the terrible news about the Jackson family. I wish I could tell you it's not true."
Office at Grady Memorial Hospital, her hands shaking as she stared at the phone. She had just seen the news about Ellen Jackson's murder and Philip's disappearance, and now she found herself facing an impossible ethical dilemma. As a doctor, she was bound by patient confidentiality, but as a human being, she possessed information that could be crucial to the investigation. The memory of her last conversation with Philip Jackson played over and over in her mind. "Dr. Carter, please," Philip had pleaded, his usually commanding voice reduced to a desperate whisper. "You can't tell anyone about this. My whole life, my ministry, everything would be destroyed." Amelia had agreed then, but now the weight of that promise felt unbearable. With a deep breath, Amelia made her decision. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Atlanta Police Department. "Detective Carter, please," she said when the receptionist answered. "It's about the Jackson case. I have information that might be important." Detective Aisha Carter arrived at Grady Memorial within the hour, her mind racing with possibilities as she was led to Dr. Carter's office. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover the key to the entire case. Dr. Carter looked up as Aisha entered, her face etched with worry and guilt. "Detective," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you goes against everything I believe in as a doctor, but I can't stay silent, not when a woman has been murdered." Aisha leaned forward, her pen poised over her notepad. "Go on, Dr. Carter. Anything you can tell us could be crucial." Dr. Carter took a deep breath. "About a week ago, Philip Jackson came to see me. He was distraught. He had just found out that none of his children were biologically his." Aisha felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the missing piece of the puzzle. "How did he find out?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice neutral. "It started with a routine blood test for Caleb, their second oldest," Dr. Carter explained. "The results showed a blood type that was impossible given Philip and Ellen's blood types. Philip insisted on DNA tests for all the children. The results, well, they confirmed his worst fears." As Dr. Carter continued to explain the details of her interactions with Philip, Aisha's mind was already racing ahead, connecting the dots, the frequent hospital visits, the withdrawals, the desperate phone calls. It all made sense now. "Dr. Carter," Aisha said as she stood to leave. "I can't thank you enough for coming forward. I know it wasn't an easy decision." Dr. Carter nodded, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Just find him, detective. Find Philip before he does something else he can't take back." Back at the precinct, Aisha called her team together. "All right, people, listen up," she began, her voice sharp with urgency. "We've got new information on the Jackson case, and it changes everything. As she laid out what she had learned from Dr. Carter, she could see the shock on her colleagues' faces. Even in a city like Atlanta, where they thought they had seen it all, this case was proving to be something extraordinary. "I want every available officer on this," Aisha instructed. "Check airports, bus stations, car rental agencies." Philip Jackson couldn't have just vanished into thin air. Someone, somewhere, has seen him. As her team dispersed, each with their assigned tasks, Aisha turned back to the evidence board. She added a new photo, a family portrait of the Jacksons taken just months ago. They looked so happy, so perfect. But now, looking at it with new eyes, Aisha could see the strain in Philip's smile, the tension in Ellen's posture. "What were you thinking, Ellen?" Aisha murmured, her eyes fixed on the smiling face of the murdered woman. "Did you really think you could keep this secret forever?" But even as she asked the question, Aisha knew the answer didn't matter anymore. Ellen Jackson was dead. Her children were orphaned. And her husband was a fugitive. Whatever reasons or justifications Ellen might have had, they had died with her in that blood-soaked kitchen. Now, all that mattered was finding Philip Jackson and bringing him to justice. But as the hours ticked by with no new leads, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step behind. Little did she know, Philip Jackson was closer than anyone realized. And he was far from finished with his terrible mission. While the police scoured Atlanta for any sign of him, Philip Jackson was holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. The room was small and dingy, a far cry from the comfortable home he had shared with Ellen and the children. But none of that mattered to Philip now. He sat on the edge of the bed, his once immaculate suit rumpled and stained, his eyes fixed on the muted TV screen. News reports about Ellen's murder and his disappearance played on a loop, each replay driving the knife of betrayal deeper into his heart. "Liar," he muttered, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "You are all liars." In his mind, Philip could still see the shocked faces of his congregation as he had stood before them just days ago, preaching about honesty and fidelity. How many of them had known? How many had whispered behind his back, laughing at the foolish pastor who couldn't see what was right in front of him? And Jeremiah. Pastor Jeremiah Simons. The man who had mentored him. The man who had stood beside him at the altar on his wedding day. The man who, for 12 years, had smiled and prayed with Philip, while secretly fathering his children. A wave of nausea washed over Philip as he thought of Jeremiah. He stumbled to the bathroom, retching into the grimy toilet. When the spasm passed, he looked up at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. The face that stared back at him was barely recognizable. His eyes were bloodshot, his cheeks sunken, his once neatly trimmed beard now wild and unkempt. This was the face of a man who had lost everything. His family. His faith. His very identity. As he stared at his reflection, Philip felt a cold resolve settle over him. He wasn't finished yet. There was still one more act to perform. One final sermon to deliver. With shaking hands, he reached for the burner phone he had purchased with cash at a gas station. He dialed a number from memory, his heart pounding as he waited for an answer. "Hello." The voice on the other end was familiar, warm, unsuspecting. "Jeremiah," Philip said, his voice eerily calm. "We need to talk." Pastor Jeremiah Simons stood in his office at New Life Community Church, his hand still gripping the phone long after Philip had hung up. A cold sweat had broken out over his face. "This can't be happening," he whispered. But it was. And as the de facto leader of the church in Philip's absence, Jeremiah knew he had to do something. With a heavy heart, he climbed the steps to the church entrance and turned to face the waiting crowd. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "I know you've all heard the terrible news about the Jackson family. I wish I could tell you it's not true, but..." He paused, swallowing hard. "But it is. Ellen Jackson is gone, taken from us in an act of senseless violence. Pastor Philip is missing, and right now, we have more questions than answers. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone called out, "What about the children?" James held up a hand for silence. "The children are safe. They're being cared for by professionals who can help them through this traumatic time. Right now, the best thing we can do is pray. Pray for Ellen's soul. Pray for the children's well-being. And yes, pray for Philip's safe return." As James led the congregation in prayer, Detective Aisha Carter was across town, poring over the Jacksons' phone records. Something wasn't adding up. Forehead, and he felt as if the floor was tilting beneath his feet. He had seen the news, of course, the whole city was talking about nothing else, but he had convinced himself that Philip couldn't possibly know the truth, that his secret, their secret, was still safe. Now, with just a few words, Philip had shattered that illusion. Jeremiah sank into his chair, his mind racing. Should he call the police? But what would he tell them? That he was the real father of Philip's children? That he had betrayed his protégé, his friend, in the worst possible way? Before he could decide, there was a knock at his office door. "Pastor Simons?" His secretary's voice was hesitant. "There's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Jeremiah's heart nearly stopped. It couldn't be, could it? "Who is it, Martha?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's Pastor Jackson, sir. Philip Jackson." For a moment, Jeremiah considered fleeing, running out the back door and never looking back. But he knew it was too late for that. This confrontation had been 12 years in the making, and there was no escaping it now. "Send him in, Martha," Jeremiah said, standing up on shaky legs. The door opened, and Philip Jackson stepped into the office. He looked nothing like the polished, confident Pastor Jeremiah had known for years. This Philip was disheveled, his eyes wild with a mix of grief and rage. "Hello, Jeremiah," Philip said, his voice unnaturally calm. "It's time we had a talk about family." As the door closed behind Philip, sealing the two men in the office, neither of them noticed Martha picking up the phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the church grounds, oblivious to the drama unfolding within. In a patrol car just a few blocks away, Detective Aisha Carter's radio crackled to life with an urgent message. The final act of this tragedy was about to begin, and Aisha knew that the next few minutes would determine whether she could bring this case to a close or whether more blood would be spilled in the name of betrayal and revenge. The tension in Pastor Jeremiah Simons' office was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Philip Jackson stood just inside the doorway, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah's face. For his part, Jeremiah remained behind his desk, his hands gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "Philip," Jeremiah began, his voice trembling slightly. "I know you're upset, but we can talk about this. Whatever you're thinking of doing." "Upset?" Philip's laugh was hollow, devoid of any mirth. "Is that what you think I am, Jeremiah? Upset?" He took a step forward, and Jeremiah instinctively pushed his chair back. "I'm way past upset. I'm in a place I didn't even know existed until a week ago." Jeremiah swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door. "Philip, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the children." "The children?" Philip's voice rose to a shout. "Don't you dare talk to me about the children. They were never mine, were they? All these years, you watched me raise them, love them, while knowing the truth. How could you do that to me? To us?" Tears welled up in Jeremiah's eyes. "I'm sorry, Philip. God knows I'm sorry. It was never supposed to happen. Ellen and I, it was a mistake. A terrible mistake. A mistake." Philip's voice was dangerously quiet now. "A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. A mistake is burning dinner. What you and Ellen did, that was betrayal of the highest order. As Philip advanced further into the room, Jeremiah stood up, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Philip, listen to me. I know you're hurting. I know you feel betrayed. But violence isn't the answer. It won't undo what's been done. Think about your faith, about everything you've preached.